reason for that is that I was the project manager who delivered the guidance that we published back in 2014 and developed a relatively intimate knowledge of the guidance and the process that we went through to develop it. So I'm going to talk for around about 30 minutes or thereabouts. I've got quite a lot of slides, and we will be sharing all of the slides with you after the broadcast. And no doubt already we've actually got quite a few questions coming in already, which I'm going to ignore until we get to the end of the presentation, if that's okay, because I can't think and type and speak at the same time. But I'm very happy to take questions at the end. We've got about half an hour for that. And I'm also happy to take questions by email and telephone afterwards, and my contact details are towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to rattle through the slides. As I say, we can take questions at the end. There is quite a lot of material, so please bear with us, and we'll see how we get on. So in terms of an outline for the presentation, I'm going to briefly talk about how and why we reviewed the visualization guidance. I'm going to talk about what I call the paradigm shift between 2006 and 2014. Talk a little bit about the evidence and the field testing that lies behind those changes. Then I'll summarise the key changes between the old version and the new version of the guidance. I want to talk a little bit about verification towards the end, because that has caused a bit of confusion since we published the guidance. And then the last slide, I'm really going to talk about what we're doing next in terms of the next revision of the guidance and the digital viewer and a few other things like that, just to try and keep you all up to date with where we're going on this subject. So, how and why we review the guidance? Well, the 2006 version was becoming quite out of date. So in around about 2011, recognizing that new methods were emerging, digital photography was revolutionizing the way that we do visualizations, we decided that it was time to give the guidance a refresh. Around about the same time, we also received a request from the Energy Minister up here in Scotland, who wanted to see a single methodology for wind farm visualizations. And that's because, as many of you will know, there are a number of different methods and standards out there, and the Minister was very keen that we had a single method across Scotland which everybody could work towards. So to do that, we set up a steering group comprising of ourselves, the Landscape Institute Scotland, Scottish Government Planning and their Energy Consents and Deployment Unit, and the Highland Council, Heads of Planning Scotland, to make sure we had that all-important planning authority input, and Scottish Renewables, because we wanted to make sure that the guidance was fit for purpose and worked for developers as much as it worked for decision makers and consultees. We then embarked on quite a lengthy process of field testing, which I'll summarise in a moment, and a consultation exercise and a draft of the guidance back in 2013. So moving on to how we actually review the guidance, you should now have in front of you a picture of a relatively nice looking wind farm, which is a site called Drumderg in Perthshire, not a million miles away from where I'm based. And this was the wind farm that we used to test the methodology that we set out in the new guidance. There's two main reasons why we use this wind farm. The first is because it's quite near my office, which sounds lazy, but it's realistic, because I did visit it on about 30 or 40 occasions in total, I think, in the end. But we also chose this wind farm, and in particular the viewpoint on the screen in front of you, because it's a good shot of the site. There's a lot of detail in the image. There are lots of different aspects of that view which we could use to test the visualization methodology. There's buildings, field boundaries, shelter belts, lots of things that we could use to scale and line up the images as we tested them in the field. So this particular viewpoint was chosen as the main one for the field testing exercise. From that viewpoint and from several others, we took a very large amount of photography. I'm not going to go through the detail on this slide, but as you can see, we tested out 5 principal combinations of camera and camera lenses. That was to try and make sure that we tested all the different opportunities out there, and also we understood the limitations of different types of cameras and different types of lenses. The one at the bottom is effectively the combination that we settled upon at the end of the process. So that's a full frame sensor camera and a 50mm fixed focal length lens, and I'll come back to lenses a bit later on. But the detail on this slide is not important, it's just to reassure you that we did actually get quite a lot of cameras and lenses and did a fairly exhaustive and detailed testing process. Moving on to the actual visualizations themselves, we also tested a wide range, a wide variety of printed visualizations in the field at the viewpoint. So the majority of the field testing we did was actually in the viewpoints with the wind farm in front of us. Obviously it's a real wind farm, not a pretend one. So we were able to take all of the different formats of images that you can see in front of you, stand at the viewpoint and have a fairly good discussion about which of those images gave us the best representation of the wind farm in front of us. Again, the detail of all those different formats doesn't really matter. What does matter is that we had a very strong consensus amongst all of the people that we took to the 4 viewpoints that format B and format G were the images that gave them the best representation of the wind farm. And those effectively became the format that we've recommended in the 2014 guidance. So just to summarise the field testing, so we took a total of 82 people to a selection of 4 viewpoints. Those viewpoints were at 5, 4, 11 and 20 kilometres from the wind farm, all in quite different landscape views and obviously at different distances, because we were keen to make sure that the methodology worked in different views and up to 20 kilometres from the wind farm. The people who were involved in the tests were quite a varied background. We had obviously landscape architects, we had visualization practitioners, we had some wind farm developers, quite a few planning officers, some planning reporters, and some key staff from the Energy Consents and Deployment Unit in the Scottish Government. All of whom were pretty experienced people in terms of looking at wind farm applications, including a public inquiry. We also had a number of SNH staff, some of whom who do wind farm casework, but we also deliberately took 4 SNH staff who do no wind farm casework and have got no experience of using wind farm visualizations. They were our sort of pretend members of the public, if you like. We wanted to test how they would react to the different visualizations as well. And hopefully, unsurprisingly, they came to pretty much the same conclusions that all of the professionals did in terms of which format of images worked best in the field. So, lots of field testing, lots of photographs, lots of images, and they did lead us to make some quite significant changes between the 2006 guidance, which many of you are probably familiar with, to the 2014 guidance, published the year before last. The main shift really between those 2 bits of guidance is that we've moved from trying to recreate geometrically accurate images based on perspective geometry, and we've moved to an approach which is more about providing an image which is easier for people to understand and provides a better perception of scale and distance in the landscape. As a result of that, the viewing distance, something which many of you have probably debated in the past, is dead. We no longer recommend that images are fixed or viewed at a fixed viewing distance. And we've also moved from cylindrical to planar projection. And I'll explain a bit more about that later on. But that really is the main change that we made from 2006 to 2014. Sounds quite straightforward, but the implications, as most of you will know, are quite significant. So to say that again using pictures, the slide now in front of you is really what the 2006 guidance was based on. In fact, both of these images are taken from that guidance. So the old guidance was based on the principle that if you hold any image at the correct distance from your eyes, you can recreate the perspective of the view in front of you. That was based on sheer geometry and mathematics and the principle of Leonardo's window, which is the little diagram at the bottom of the slide. And at that time, in terms of LVIA and visualization thinking, that was kind of deemed to be the most appropriate way to create quote-unquote accurate visualizations. So they were, I think it's fair to say, geometrically accurate. If held at the correct viewing distance, they did provide the correct geometry of the view, both obviously the landscape and the proposed wind turbines. But through the field testing and from feedback from the consultation exercise and more widely, it became apparent that actually this geometrical approach to wind farm visualizations wasn't working as well as we might have liked. So again, to say the same story in a few more pictures, because this certainly took me quite a long time to get my head around, and I may well have confused some of you already. Plenty of time for questions at the end. But what the photograph in front of you now shows is some of the field testing, the same wind farm from a different viewpoint. And the gentleman on the left-hand side in the stripy shirt is using a transparency image. He's trying to hold it at the right viewing distance, and he's lining up the turbines in the landscape behind him. And as you probably all know, on a transparency, you can of course make the turbines all line up and the landscape as well. The geometry is correct. However, when you print that image onto a regular piece of paper that the gentleman on the right-hand side of the image has got, the turbines look a bit small. And that was a fairly consistent message that we've picked up from some local authorities, from our own staff, and from members of the public, that they thought wind farm visualizations were quite often making the turbines look too small, regardless of the paper size and the viewing distance, etc., etc. Luckily, the answer to that question was largely answered for us by a gentleman called Alan MacDonald, who runs a company called Architect in Inverness, and colleagues in the Highland Council, who prior to our own review did a lot of their own field testing and a bit of science with the University of Stirling to try and understand this issue of why turbines on the images didn't quite look like the turbines in the real landscape. There's a long and complicated answer to that question, which I'm not going to go into now because I've only got half an hour. But I will give you a reference to a book in a few slides' time which explains very clearly and with very good illustrations why that is the case. But in essence, it's because when you take an image of a landscape and you print that onto a piece of flat paper, you lose all of the depth and the scale cues that you have in the real landscape, and you compress them onto a 2D image on a piece of paper, and therefore the turbines look smaller. It's exactly the same effect as we all have when we go on skiing holidays or go to the Alps. We take a picture of a great landscape, and when we look at it at home, it just doesn't quite capture the impressive landscape that we visited on our holidays. And that's for exactly the same reason. A 2D flat photograph can never give you the same impression of the landscape view as that which you experience with your own eyes in the landscape. So that was the problem. So we tested this in quite a lot of detail using transparency images, such as the one as you see in front of you, with printed photographs, such as the snowy view that you should now have in front of you, and various different combinations of those photographs. The photograph you see in front of you at the moment is a 50mm A3 single frame, obviously not A3 depending on what size of screen you're using, but it was an A3 image in hard copy. And the consensus view, if you remember back to a few slides before, was that an image called format B, which is this image, was the one that provided the best representation of the wind farm in reality. And that's, in effect, a 75mm equivalent single frame. I'll come back to focal lengths a bit later. But just to go back between those images to give you that impression again, there's the 50mm image, and there's the 75. It's not a huge difference, but it's enough of a difference to make us change the methodology. If we just go back again to that previous slide, you'll see on the format A image, which is a 50mm single frame, excuse me, there's a white box in the middle of that image, and effectively the second image, which I'll move to now, format B, is simply a crop and enlargement of the center of the 50mm photograph. So what we've really done in the new methodology is we've simply said you should crop and enlarge your photographs to compensate for that lack of depth and distance cues in the image and to give you a better impression of the real scale and distance in the landscape. So to summarize that, here's the paradigm shift. So the transparency is the left-hand side of this slide. There's a 50mm photograph, and there's a 75mm photograph, which is cropped out of 50mm on the right-hand side. And as I say, there was a very strong consensus between all of the people that we took to those viewpoints that the 75mm equivalent images provided the best representation in reality at the viewpoints. There were some minor variations on that, but by and large the consensus at the end of the testing process was very, very clear. So effectively, what we now recommend is you're viewing a cropped image which is enlarged to a certain size. We no longer recommend that you try and view that at a specific viewing distance, but that you simply view that at a comfortable arm's length. Whether you're holding that visualization in the field, looking at the ES, or indeed looking at it on a screen, or indeed looking at it at a public exhibition on the hall of the wall of the village hall, wherever you may well view it. What we're saying is always view these images at a comfortable arm's length, and that should, as near as damn it, give you a good impression of the wind farm. There were also practical reasons for changing that recommendation. The first was we found that actually in the field, almost nobody could really use a viewing distance accurately anyway. And secondly, the old format images, which were in cylindrical format, and therefore you should theoretically view them curved, again, that was almost impossible to do at the viewpoint, and that was on quite good days like this day in summer with no wind. So for practical reasons, as well as a result of field testing, we've moved away from a viewing distance and we've moved into planar images, which should be viewed flat rather than curved. So the new methodology is a lot more prescriptive than the old guidance. We now are relatively prescriptive about the camera and type of lens that should be used. That's a full frame sensor camera and a 50mm fixed focal length lens. There's two real reasons for that. The first is the size of images we now recommend are quite large, and a lot of other camera and lens formats just don't give you sufficient resolution for the enlargements we recommend. The second reason is that by using full frame sensor camera and a fixed focal length lens, we always know the exact properties of the photograph taken in the field. That reduces the risk of mistakes in the production process, and it also facilitates the verification process that I'll come on to in a few minutes' time. So quite prescriptive about camera and lens. We've also standardized the height of the camera, 1.5 meters, and we've specified that the images should be cropped and enlarged to the equivalent of a 75mm image. Now that has caused a bit of confusion. So what we are saying is to use a 50mm fixed focal length lens on the camera, but from that photograph you crop and enlarge to the equivalent of a 75mm image. So you're basically recreating a photograph as if it was taken with a 75mm lens. But we always use that 50mm fixed focal length as our fixed reference point. We've then specified the size of image on paper. I won't go into all those details just now because I'm sure you've all read the guidance before, and specified both the vertical field of view and the horizontal field of view that we think the images should be presented at. And all of that detail is set out in the annex to the guidance. So, on to the sort of most important part really is what do the images look like that we now recommend. Well, they don't look like this because they should be printed at A1 length and A4 in height. But effectively, we now recommend a package of 5 different images in total from each viewpoint. The first is at the top of this slide. It's a baseline photo montage, 90 to 360 degrees as required. No turbines in that image is to give you the landscape of visual context only, and there's matching wireline at the bottom, which is good for illustrating your cumulative effects. The second image in the middle is a traditional wireline, which most of you will be familiar with. And the third at the bottom is the 75mm equivalent photomontage. Again, A1 length and A4 in height. So those are the three images that we recommend should be included in the ES in hard copy, and also used in public exhibition if required. Additionally, we also will be recommending the production of a simple JPEG image for use in a digital viewer. More on that in a moment. And also, we're recommending that a viewpoint pack is provided, which includes single frame images only. The reason behind that is that if, as many of you will probably have done, if you go to a viewpoint on a windy day or a rainy day, it's very difficult to work with long landscape format images, whereas the single frame printed on A3 is actually much easier to use at the viewpoint. And of course, at the viewpoint, whether you're a planning officer or a member of the public, you have the landscape in front of you. And all the single frame is doing is it's giving you the wind farm, telling you where it is, giving an indication of the height of the turbines, and showing you the layout. Whereas, if you're in the planning committee, in the village hall, looking at the ES, or anywhere else for that matter, we are very keen that people look at the longer landscape panorama, which gives you a wider view of the wind farm and provides that all-important landscape and visual context. So I'll just go back to the previous slide, and this slide in itself actually makes this point quite well. The photomontage at the bottom shows you the wind farm, gives you a little bit of landscape and visual context. But actually the JPEG for the digital viewer on this slide shows you that there's some quite important landscape and visual context to the left and the right of those images. On the right hand side we've got Ailith Hill, quite a prominent local viewpoint. On the left hand side we've got a view right into the heart of the Cairngorms National Park. So landscape and visual context, in our opinion, is very, very important to landscape and visual assessment, and therefore the primary images that we think planning officials, committee members and others should be looking at are the big photomontages in the ES, and that single frame image we think should only ever be used at the viewpoint on site where that landscape and visual context should be in front of you, unless of course the weather is terrible, which it often was at this viewpoint. So just to convince you all that this isn't something that we just made up, in addition to the field testing, the consultation process I've just described, as I said before, the Highland Council have also done a lot of work and analysis on this over the years. They commissioned some work from the University of Stirling, full references on the slide in front of you, where they came to very much the same conclusion, that 70 to 75mm equivalent images gave you a better impression of the landscape in reality. The book that I referred to before, which can explain all of this in far greater detail than I can, is a book called Wind Farm Visualizations, Perspective or Perception by Al MacDonald of Architect in Inverness. So for those of you who are currently scratching your heads and wondering what on earth I'm talking about in terms of focal lengths and everything else, I thoroughly recommend Alan's book. It's a very well illustrated and very clear description of what the issues behind wind farm visualizations really are. So just to summarise those key changes, the new guidance is more prescriptive, but there are some options and flexibility within there. So for example, we recognise that at some viewpoints, perhaps in a steep Welsh Valley for example, you may have to use portrait images to capture the full landscape and visual context. We've said that's fine as long as it's agreed with the consultees. And again, we've provided some flexibility in the production process so that at more challenging viewpoints there is some flexibility about how the practitioner can produce their images for the ES. And that's simply to recognise that the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of creating visualizations can be quite difficult, particularly in wide flat landscapes where there's very little, very few things which you can use to actually orientate your image, for example. We've also standardised the image size. We've set out a verification method, which I'll describe shortly. We've moved this equivalent of 75mm images cropped and enlarged from a 50mm photograph. And as I've said before, they're effectively larger images which should be viewed flat and held at a comfortable arm's length. Annex B in the guidance sets out the must-haves. These are the things that we think applications should comply with, and these are things that we in SNH will check on applications when they arrive on our desk, just to make sure that everyone is following the new guidance. I think it's fair to say that so far, after a pretty short bedding in process, the majority of applications that we now see are actually following this guidance very well, and the quality of the images that we're generally seeing is very, very good, with one or two exceptions. But that's the detail of Annex B. So for the planning officers amongst you, these are things that we think we should be checking to make sure that the applicant has actually done what the guidance says they should do. I want to just briefly mention verification. I don't have long to do that, but there was two main reasons for including this. The first was the Highland Council and their own standards provide a verification process, and the Minister was quite keen that we did something similar. But it was also to recognise that it's really important that we maintain public trust in wind farm visualizations. As many of you will know, whether a developer, a consultant, or a planning officer, at nearly every wind farm application, somebody somewhere would have probably questioned the accuracy of the visualizations. And we want to move away from that, because actually that's a distraction from the important question, which is this a good place to build a wind farm or not? So we've introduced this verification process to try and make it as easy as possible for people to test the images and hopefully convince them that they're a good representation of the landscape. So we can all put those questions behind us and then focus on whether the wind farm is in the right place or not. So as the slide says, people tend to know landscapes very well, and they will question visualizations if they don't think they match the landscape in front of them. And indeed, many people in the past have done so. So the purpose of the verification process is to allow them to test the images, but we have made it clear that that's only a process that you would follow if it's required. In many circumstances, most people might be quite happy to take the single frame images to the viewpoint and have a quick look in the field themselves. And 9 times out of 10, I would suggest that that's as much verification as is required. If you stand at the viewpoint and the landscape looks wrong, the image is wrong. If the landscape looks about right, well, that's probably good enough for your assessment. However, there is a much more detailed verification process set out in the guidance in the annex, and that does involve going back and sourcing the original photograph from the developer, checking for the metadata in that image, what kind of camera they used, what kind of lens they used, and then checking that that image has been correctly manipulated to form the visualizations which either the member of the public or the planning officer has in front of them. I won't go through the detail of that process just now, but you can hopefully see that we've set out quite a detailed process there, which should allow people to check right back from the original photograph to the image in front of them, whether it's a single frame or a photo montage in the ES. They can check how that image has been manipulated, and they can check that it's been enlarged to the correct size and the correct dimensions. What the practitioner who actually produces the visualizations needs to do is quite simple. They provide some markings on the baseline panorama, that's all set out in detail in the guidance. They make the original photographs available on request. They keep a full record of all the photography, so that if challenged, they can show what they've done and why. And if there are any variations from the standards set out in the guidance, they should document those so that the planning officer, the reporter, the inspector, whoever, can understand why the images might be a little bit different from the standard set out in the SNH guidance. As I said before, what the user can do is firstly take the visualizations to the viewpoint and test it there. 9 out of 10, that should be sufficient. But if they want to, they can obtain that photograph and follow that process that was on the last slide. Fairly straightforward to do. What you do need to do is download a template, which is available on the website, and find yourself a ruler. But apart from that, the process is actually relatively straightforward. It effectively involves printing out a template what that is here, the slide in front of you, printing that at the right size, that's A3, dropping that on top of the original photograph, again printed at the specified size, and then satisfying yourself that the image within the white box in the center of that image has been cropped out and enlarged to the right size, which again is specified in the guidance. Sounds quite complex, but actually when you get paper on in front of you, it all makes a lot of sense, and it's easier than I can be explained. So that's the verification process. Just to finish off, I was asked to quickly look at the difference between the SNH guidance and some of the other guidance issues out there. So I'll principally show you the difference between our guidance and the Highland Council's visualization standards, which many of you will be familiar with. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you've got 5 images recommended by SNH. On the right-hand side, there are the 4 images required by Highland Council. They look different, but they're actually in some ways quite similar. So the first and most important point to make is that they're both based on the same photography. We've standardized the lens type, we've standardized the camera type, and the size of the images. So the main photography requirements between us and Highland Council are all the same, which means a developer can produce both of these images, both of these sections of visualizations from the same baseline photography. However, the Highland Council requires something a little bit different in terms of presentation. The first difference is that their images are all printed at A3, and the second is that they require both a 50 and a 75mm single frame image in the ES, and also their panoramas are 65 degrees rather than the 53.7 that we recommend. So there's good reasons for that. Highland Council have reached a slightly different conclusion themselves on what they think works best. And we've taken a slightly different view in SNH. We think the landscape and visual context is extremely important, and that's why we've recommended the suite of images that we have on the left-hand side there. But nonetheless, we have at least formed a single standard in terms of photographic requirements, which is very good for a developer paying for an LVIA with 20 or 25 viewpoints in it. So those are the key differences between ourselves and Highland Council. At the bottom of that image, you'll see the single frame images. That's just to make the point that the viewpoint pack that we recommend and the 75mm single frame image that the Highland Council recommend are identical. And I do mean identical. So where we're going next? We're hoping to have our digital viewer ready early in 2016. So in the meantime, we're not recommending that developers produce their JPEGs for those yet because the viewer is not ready. We're also looking to conclude some research on the use of visualizations. So we've done 2 phases of research, visiting wind farm exhibitions and planning committee meetings, and actually looking at how people use the visualizations in practice. We've been interviewing councillors and members of the public, trying to understand a bit more about what they need, what are their requirements. And that may well lead to some changes in the next version of the guidance. We'll be reconvening our steering group in February and March this year, once that research is complete, and we will be undertaking a small review of the guidance to see if any changes are required. And obviously the experience that we've all had in the last 18 months of seeing the new visualizations will feed into that. At the same time, we're doing some research on small-scale turbines, sort of single turbines and 2 turbines on farms, and we're hoping to provide some slightly more detailed guidance on how visualizations for smaller developments should be presented. And again, the review of the guidance will include some further advice on that in due course. So that's about all I've got to say. Here are my contacts. For those that don't have a chance to answer questions, ask questions rather, you can follow up with me after this discussion as and when you feel fit. I'm very happy to try and answer your queries. And I think we'll move to questions and answers.
Hi again, Brendan. Thank you very much for that presentation. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm just going to go through these questions now, and then we'll wait and you can answer them one by one. Okay, so regarding uptake from Simon Adele. Any particular authorities in England? I'm aware that some have gone for the Highland guidance.
Yeah, I couldn't list them from memory, but at least 3 or 4 I'm familiar with. I think have adopted the Highland Council standards, and I can understand why they've done that. As you would expect, I would make a simple pitch to use the SNH approach, because I think it provides a better blend of images, and it provides exactly the same impression of the wind farm in reality, with the added advantage of some additional landscape and visual context. But obviously, people have looked at them both and they've come to their own conclusions. I suspect, though, that that might be because relatively few people outside of Scotland will have seen images which comply with our new guidance. All of the planning officers I've met in Scotland, having seen those new images, they've reached the same conclusion that we have. So I'm kind of hoping that the SNH standard will become standard, and we'll have fewer authorities adopting alternative guidance.
Yeah, I suppose one approach would be far simpler. Okay, thank you for that one. Well, a question from Steve now. He says, I just need a bit more clarification. If SNH feel that a single frame image cannot provide enough landscape and visual context, why make panoramic views mandatory only as they have well-known limitations too? Finally, from my experience, I've found that consultees prefer an accurate representation of scale rather than context. After all, local people know more about the landscape context than anybody else.
Well, I would absolutely agree with Steve's last point. I think local people do know the landscapes extremely well. But I also think that the wider panoramic images that we now recommend actually do provide you the same impression of scale and distance that the single frame images do. Only I would argue they actually do it better because they provide that landscape and visual context as well. So just for those of you that aren't so familiar with the types of images we're talking about, if you take the large panoramic image that we now recommend, and you take the single frame image, and you photocopy that onto a transparency, and you stick it on the middle of our panorama, the two are absolutely identical. And therefore our view is that the wider panorama, it does the same job in terms of scale and distance, but it also gives you that little bit more landscape and visual context. The main limitation of that single frame image is because it's only 27 degrees wide, in some cases it won't even capture the whole wind farm, particularly if you're at sort of smaller distances of 2, 3, 4 kilometers from the wind farm, or if it's a very large wind farm. So in our view, that wider landscape and visual context is essential, and the wider horizontal field of view is often important to capture the wind farm, as well as neighbouring wind farms if it's a cumulative assessment.
I'm going to read this one out, and please tell me if I'm incorrect in saying it, but it's from our Head of Technical and Professional, Simon Adele here at the LI, and he says to reassure webinar attendees that the comments made by Alan MacDonald have been rebutted and folk are not to worry. He's referring to, quote, the planning system is being dictated to by a small group of landscape consultants working in conjunction with SNH and the wind farm industry, who clearly have got things wrong in the past and continue to be involved directly or indirectly in the process. They have simply developed another way of misleading the wider audience through local authority e-planning portals. This extract was taken from the conclusion page 24, paragraph 3 of Alan MacDonald's review in October 2015. So just reading that quote out verbatim there.
Yeah, so I completely disagree with that quote as well, and yes, I can reassure people that that quote has been rebutted by the Landscape Institute, and SNH certainly don't agree at all with what Mr. MacDonald is saying there. I think what's very unfortunate here is that Mr. MacDonald's book, which I referred you all to earlier, is an excellent resource. It's a really good description of wind farm visualizations and some of the limitations. It is, of course, quite critical of SNH and our previous guidance. I think some of that criticism is misplaced, but nonetheless, I actually think a lot of the science that Mr. MacDonald is advocating is actually quite true, and he deserves credit for moving the SNH methodology from 2006 to 2014. That move is almost entirely based on Mr. McDonald's work and his research and his field work, for which he does deserve credit. Unfortunately, Mr. McDonald does seem to think that there's some kind of conspiracy going on here, and quite clearly there isn't.
Okay, thank you. This next question is from Matthew. Where do you stand on the revised Highlands Council Visualisation Guidance? In relation to this, we have been requested by the Leeds Council to use the Highlands Council Guidance on a residential development. I guess my other question is, because there has not been a revised visualisation guidance by the LI, although I do hear there is one due out this year to cover all visualisations rather than just wind farms, where do we stand on this, as surely the Highland Council Visualisation Guidance shouldn't really, sorry, I've got screen glare, shouldn't really bear any standing for a site in Leeds, as they are totally different?
Sure, so two questions there. I can't really comment on wind farm visualisation guidance being used for other forms of development. That is, as Matthew says, something that the LI are looking at. And we have tested this methodology on anything other than wind farms, and therefore I wouldn't necessarily recommend that it's used for anything else. I'm sure that the basic principles behind it probably still hold true, but we have done no testing on any other form of development, so I wouldn't recommend it was used for that. Obviously, from our perspective, we'd like the Highland Council to adopt our own guidance, so we can have a single approach. They have different views, and that's fine. We respect that. In terms of the update from the Landscape Institute, I think, as I understand it, the technical committee is working on a piece of work on that, and something is due out quite soon. So hopefully that will provide a bit of clarity for Matthew and others.
Okay, question from Crispin next. Will the digital viewer run on all devices from 5-inch to 40-inch screens? How will that help in standardizing understanding of images?
The viewer will run on anything, but what we'll be recommending is you only use the viewer on a regular PC-sized screen, because otherwise the image will be too small. It's as simple as that. I think that's one of the limitations that we see of other approaches, which is, unless you're using it on the right size of the screen, you're not going to get the same impression of the wind farm. What we've tried to achieve with the 5 images that we've sent out in the guidance is consistency between the large A1 panorama, the A3 single frame in the viewpoint pack, and eventually the digital viewer on screen. So we're trying to get a consistent impression of the wind farm across all of those images, and that's why we think it's important that should be viewed on a full-size PC screen.
Stephen adds, seeing your 75mm image reminded me of the image/monitor resolution issue. The turbines are difficult to make out. The SNH guidance needs to provide requirements on image and viewing screen resolution. I've seen too many images which have inadequate resolution.
Yeah, so that's a fair point from Stephen. I mean, the images I've used in the PowerPoint slides have been compressed just to make the PowerPoint presentation manageable. The A3 single frames that we've seen submitted by developers are of very good quality. That's the hard copies. Obviously, there is always a limitation and an issue, which is that many local authorities scan those, convert them to a PDF, and then put them onto the replanning website. That can sometimes lead to poorer quality images. And that's why we'd always recommend that people refer back to the images in the ES, or if they can, get a hold of the viewpoint pack and go and view properly printed images of the right resolution out in the field. I think Stephen raises a valid point here, though, which is, there's a limit to which we can control the media and the formats through which people will view these images. As many of you will know, the local newspaper will often be the first place to take a wind farm visualization and print it on their front page at completely the wrong size and quite often in black and white. So, we've got to be realistic about the control that we will have over how people consume these images. What we've sent out in the guidance is an attempt, but an attempt only, to try and make sure that at least if someone looks at ES, they go to a wind farm public exhibition, or they view the images on screen through the digital viewer, which is still a work in progress, they will see a consistent and high quality image. But obviously in some other circumstances, the resolution can be quite poor.
Catherine asks, wouldn't portrait images, if made into panoramas and printed at A1 times A4, make the development appear smaller or further away, given greater vertical frame of view?
Potentially, yes, and that's why we've said that's an option only to be used in limited circumstances. I think what I've seen one or two developers do where they have had to use portrait images is they provided a full height portrait image to show the full landscape and visual context of a steep sanded valley, for example. When they've actually put the turbines on it, they've effectively cropped that vertical field of view down to show the turbines and to provide the same vertical field of view that we recommended in the guidance. So unfortunately you end up with another image in your ES, but you still get both the visual context and a good representation of the turbines in the views. It's a bit of a compromise.
Graham asks, or says, you cannot reuse the photography between THC and SNH guidance as there are differing requirements for how the photography is processed. SNH allow processing as cylindrical, whereas THC requires everything processed on single frame.
Yeah, so it's the same photograph, but the production process can be different. If I'm honest, I don't really know why the Highland Council have a problem with cylindrical projection in processing. I've never quite understood that. We're quite flexible, and as long as the image at the end of the process meets the requirements set out in our guidance, we're quite happy with that. But as far as I understand that, you can still use the same photograph, you simply treat that differently in the production process.
Okay, Ruth, why does this approach only consider wind turbine visualization? Has any work been done on applying the same methodology to major non-wind farm developments in the landscape?
Yeah, I'd love to have time, Ruth, but we simply haven't had time to extend this work beyond wind farms. And to be honest, I'm not sure that'd be a priority for us because the other forms of development that we tend to deal with tend not to have that significant landscape and visual impacts anyway. But as I said before, I do understand that the Landscape Institute is doing some further work on that. So maybe Simon could give us some information on that later on.
Yep, as I said, if any of these questions, if they're not quite fair to ask Brendan, or in his, what this is about, and you want to kind of extend your frame of question a bit wider, please do send them in, and we'll do our best within the team to answer them. There'll be a link sent out 24 hours after the webinar, or just email myself, lauren.tubb@landscapeinstitute.org. Moving on from this, Mike asks, the 1.5 mil camera height seems a bit odd, as it is not a natural height to take photographs from. Surely a better height would be 1.6 meters, which is the typical eye height of an average height person.
Thanks for that question, Mike. I can't actually now remember why we chose 1.5 meters, but that's a fair point, and I'll have to come back to Mike on that one separately because I can't remember.
There's always a reason for these things, it's just remembering why. Graham asks, regarding figures required, what is the SNH take on the viewpoint map? The guidance isn't clear whether there should be one for each VP or one general one.
What we've said in the guidance on ZTVs is there should be an overall ZTV map with all of the viewpoints marked on it. And then on each visualization, there should ideally be a thumbnail which shows the viewpoint location. And perhaps more important, in the back of the viewpoint pack images, so that's the single frame A3s which we think people should take to the viewpoint. We have recommended that people put a location map on the reverse to make sure that people can actually find the viewpoint in reality when they need to.
Elizabeth mentions that she thinks that the wider context is important, particularly when an issue is being discussed in a meeting room away from the actual landscape.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I might use that as a quote in the next guidance. No, I think that's absolutely fundamental to the difference that we've had with the Highland Council all along. I can give any number of examples of wind farms that we've assessed in Scotland where that wider view is absolutely critical, either because there's a huge wind farm off to one side, which is an important part of the cumulative assessment, or because there's an intimate view down a glen, or a view of a castle or something else, which the single frame simply cannot cover. So yes, I would agree entirely that wider context is always so important.
Dan says, given the similarities between the SNH and THC guidance now, is there any likelihood of THC revoking their guidance and SNH becoming the only necessary guidance which should be adhered to for visualizations accompanying applications to THC?
Well, Christmas has just passed, Dan, and it didn't happen this year. I think that's a question for Highland Council. They will be on the steering group for the next review, and we will be doing our level best to try and achieve a single approach going forward. But Dan probably knows the background to this as well as any other. There are differences between us, and we may not achieve that.
I'll read out Rebecca's note, but I'm not the person to answer it, but I'm sure Simon Adele will be able to, so I'll ask it, and then please do send in questions afterwards. Is the Landscape Institute planning to update their advice note, the 1st of the 11th, photography and photo montage in LVIA to come in line with this SNH guidance? Simon will probably have an answer for that, but as he is muted, he is unable to answer, but we'll try and get an answer out to you, Rebecca, in due course. So moving on to the next question. Regarding markings on the 90-degree panorama, the example supplied features a bracket denoting the central 50mm frame. However, we are permitted to work from stitched cylindrical photography where the central frame has been distorted. Should this be included?
Yes, is the short answer. There's always a risk of us kind of splitting hairs over the detail here, and from our perspective, that will still be sufficiently accurate for a user to verify the image has been correctly manipulated. There will, of course, as Graham points out, be a minor discrepancy, but that shouldn't really make any great difference.
Graham asks, do you think Mr. MacDonald should be making his own conflict of interest clearer as someone who financially benefits from the adoption of THC guidance?
I don't think I'll comment on that one.
No, I thought I'd read it out anyway. Elizabeth just wants to clarify what a standard monitor screen size is, but I believe your point was just that don't put it on a tablet because it would be too small to work from.
Yeah, so obviously screens do vary in size, but we're talking roughly A4 in height.
How would we utilise this guide dealing with close-in montages on expansive wind farms? Planar views do not allow you to use multiple pages to represent wider views. How should we approach this? Perhaps use multiple cylindrical 53.53 montages where a wider view is required.
Yeah, so Graham's asking an interesting question here. We have slightly fudged this in the guidance. We've basically said if the wind farm is either very large or you're very close to it, simply extend the horizontal field of view of your image. I think, I don't have the guidance in front of me, I think we have said that beyond a certain extent you should switch to cylindrical, and that's why we've provided that flexibility just to cater for those occasional viewpoints where you simply can't fit the whole view of the whole wind farm in your 53.5 degrees. But usually, we find that the majority of schemes do fit within that, so it's the exception rather than the rule.
Okay, just to let you know that Simon Adele from the LI has just added that where we say it has been enforced by the LI for this purpose and in the rest of the UK, this is subject to two caveats basically. So I'll read them, quote, different landscape types of wind farms and conditions in other countries may require different approaches. And the second being, it is recognised that smaller scale wind farm proposals, which is up to 3 turbines, and single turbine applications do not usually require the same level of visual representation. Then another, we're nearly at the end of the question, guys. Alan MacDonald rightfully pointed out in his risk review that SNH images viewed through e-planning portals without a digital viewer are misleading as the scale is compressed. This is a real problem for users of the SNH guidance. This issue needs to be addressed ASAP. E.g., SNH should issue a requirement for a health warning to be placed on panoramas when viewed in full via a PC. Oof.
Well, we could do that. And I think in answer to Stephen's earlier question, I said, yeah, we'll think about that in the next version. I think there's an issue though that any photo montage can be viewed incorrectly, either through e-planning or in the local newspaper, or indeed when members of the public print it out at the wrong size. And I think we have to accept that we cannot control every media through which these images will be consumed. Even the A3 images that the Highland Council specify can be printed at the wrong size and also misused. So this applies to any form of visualization. I think we can try our best, but ultimately, you know, if people do want to see the best and most accurate representation, they should have a look at ES and they should visit the Wind Farm exhibition and try and get hold of a copy that way. And hopefully, once the digital viewer is up and running, that will address this issue.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brendan. Right, okay, Simon O'Dell has got back to Rebecca from the Stance Me Ally. The answer is yes. A working group led by Bill Blackledge is working on this, but the priority is to finish what we call proportionality guidance, i.e. guidance for other situations than large wind farms first. All right then, so that brings us to the end of the questions. As we said before, please do send more questions in if you've thought of them, although this has been a very, very good and extensive kind of repartee. I hope that you found it as interesting and helpful as I have. And also, as per usual, pending a few days of admin, this will be put onto the webinar page as a YouTube link. So you can come back to it and use it time and time again as a invaluable resource. So if there's nothing else, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Brendan, for your presentation today.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everyone for listening.
All right, take care. See you next week.